Hello and welcome to Focus on Liberia. Anthony C. hosting. Welcome to our broadcast. This is a special broadcast, by the way. As many of you might be aware, today is April 14. This day, historically speaking, is a special day in the political history of Liberia. There's a word that is common in our political history. That word is called progressive. And when you hear that word, you think about certain individuals at some time in the pages of our history who stood up for something to move a country that they have loved and continue to love forward. And many started to admire them. One of those admirers is here. He is comfortably seated. His name, Darlington Collins. He always liked to say the same boy from Town. So that same boy from Town who read the pages of history, who saw the struggle of the progressive, is here. And we are talking about the struggle of the progressive. And for your information, April 14, 1979, historical facts about the progressive. And Darlington is here to do a historical, provide a historical perspective on the struggles of the progressive. Well, let me not bore you with the introduction. Darlington is here. He has done some research. He came prepared to discuss this topic. Well, Mr. Collins, it is my honor to welcome you to the Hour of Politics here at Focus on Liberia. My revolutionary salute, younger brother, welcome.
Well, thank you, brother C. It have always been my pleasure to be on your platform, to have a conversation with you, to chit chat on the way forward in our country. Generally speaking, our country have been through a whole lot historically. Whether it was the settling of the settlers, fast forward into, the struggle for political freedom, democracy, and, just all kinds of political agitation, whether it was a civil war. We have stand and always choose to stand on the side of our people, poor people, if you may, not because of their, their objective condition. It's because of the fact that their inclusiveness and their part to have a piece of the national cake, whether it is through economic development, whether it is through, political participation and involvement. So against that backdrop, we chose the side of the progressive leaning, not because, they were young people as I am. It was because the fact that these people, call progressive, if you look at the phrase progressive, we move from one state to another, a state of backwardness, in simple terms. You come from a very backward state to a more progress level, especially to progress. Have the progressive struggle done a lot of things for some of us? Yes, he have provided enlightenment for us. So today, it's very historic. It's not by accident that I'm here on the Hour of Politics. It's April 14, 1979, and today is April 14, 2021, more than 40, pretty 42 years over. It is a pleasure to sit on your platform. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. It is my pleasure having you as well. If you follow Liberian politics, more young people today, when they are finding where the fault is for the development of Liberia, they take the courage to raise their hand or they will raise their fingers at the progressive. And that is why this subject matters a whole lot. And to those of you watching, I want to remind you there is a retrospective analysis based on historical facts about the struggle of the people known in Liberia as the progressive. Mr. Collins, first of all, people listening to us might be wondering, but who is this young man and why qualifies him to be the one to talk about, this fateful April 14, when some of the progressive are still around? Somebody may be wondering. So explain to us why you felt the need, to come on this, some people call it enviable platform to discuss this critical subject?
Well, of course, I'm not the most acclaimed brothers from the progressive community to sit on this platform to share the little understanding of my perspective about the struggle of our people and just the issue about April 14, 1979. Again, people will, like you said, passively, people who have not understood what have happened to the society, they will always try to, show accusing fingers at progressive people, to say everything was okay until the progressives came. That is a shock circuit of history. People are not taking time to understand what have happened to this country. I'm Darlington, of course. I used to be a student leader in Monrovia, did some working with the Federation of Liberian Youth, the Liberian National Student Union, of course, a progressive, disciplined young man who have thought it wise to appreciate, the struggle of our people. Because you see, progressive politics is just about promoting ordinary people in simple terms. People don't understand. You need to understand the class enemy will always have an opportunity to find a way around, to find a way around scapegoating the real true issues. If we are interested in understanding who are the real troublemakers of this country called Liberia, we need to probably go back and read the findings of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of the country, the TRC report. The TRC report recount different kinds of historical analysis. It goes back beyond April 14, 1979.
Okay.
So people will argue, oh, things were okay. No, that's not true. Even when the settlers went back, right in their own tendency, it was the struggle about race. It was about the issue of color. How do you think today in Liberia today people still talk about the issue of the mulattoes and the indigenous people? Even among the settlers, it was about the issue of color. They had a class struggle right before them. Even before 1847, there have always been a struggle for equal participation. Even in their own tendency, it's not. The progressive didn't, there was nothing basically new. It's just that you had an oligarchy that has been in power for more than, 100 years. All their lives, they are used to, micromanaging political leadership in the country. They are used to distributing the wealth and the acquisition of resources just among themselves until young men, even Mr. Tobo aligned.
Mr. Collins, let's do this first of all. Let's define who all make up the progressive, first of all, so that our audience and those following will not get it mixed up. So in Liberia, from what when we say the progressive, who are the individuals that we are talking about here?
But that's the thing. I want to deal with the concept progressive. Progressive basically is a phrase or a word that symbolize the struggle of ordinary people. Even if you think about how you can alleviate people from poverty, you want to move people from one state of backwardness to a state of progress. You are equally a progressive. But the progressive movement goes back, into the 1970s with the 1960s with the establishment of the Movement of Justice and Peace in Africa, MOJA. Subsequent to the establishment of the PAL, the Progressive Alliance of Liberia, headed by peace be to his arches, G. Barcott Matthews. MOJA at the time been headed by Dr. Tipote. These were young men who at the time saw the objective condition, and it goes spreading down to the University of Liberia with the Student Unification Party. Students at the time, look at the objective condition in the state. Should we continue to stay on this state of backwardness, or should we go forward? Because before 1980, before 1980, the state have only witnessed, the domineering one-party rule, the Chewing Party. It is not just progressive people think about Matthew, Fambula, Tipote, Sawyer. Even it go back even within the Chewing Party. A man called D2A, a man called Abaport, who came from Americo-Liberian descent, who was a veteran, pamphlet. Omen Abaport will write his nice piece calling on the involvement of the people. So these people are progressive. What are you talking about? Blighting, these people, Edward Whitman Blyden, a man who was later on chased into Sierra Leone, who converted to Islam. These people who in engineering the architectural framework of progressive struggle.
Mr. Collins,
as it is cannot remain as it is. We need to now move forward from one state of backwardness to a state of progress. So progressive basically can be entrenched with the establishment of PA and Moja, and as well as the establishment of the Student Unification Party.
So let's come to the issues that were prevailing at the time, probably arguably that were stuck against the ordinary masses.
Right.
I guess my question is, what were the issues that the progressive were fighting to change? What were the social, political, and economic vices at the time that were stuck against the masses, for which they stood at the time to speak against? What were the issues at the time?
So yes, at the time, with what the progressive faced, or what the masses of the people, was ongoing, those harsh issues. The issue about the economy of the state was extremely harsh. You find that indigenous people were only kept in certain quarters that they consider slum communities. Whether it was the Nuku town, the Buse quarter, the Bassa community, those were depraved communities that were created by the ruling class at the time. That these are places that are particularly reserved for poor people's children. Before the coming of the settlers into Liberia, I don't want to use the term Americo-Liberians. The indigenous people have owned the land, but have we asked ourselves the question, how is it possible in terms of distributing wealth, the land, the resources of the country, and you find a particular family? Why, before 1980, one family will own more than 100 acres of land in Monrovia and its environs, leaving the ordinary people, the people who were originally the landowners, with nothing. The economic disparity. Their children could not attend the university bearing their own father's name. People could, they were under the Chewing Party. They could have an opportunity to sit in their Chewing Party executive committee meetings, and they could decide who will go to my village in Grand Crew as representative. They could decide who will become superintendent in Cape Mount. They could also decide who will become senator of Lofa County. So that was the kind of political, issues at the time that the progressives saw and said, no, if you are running a democratic state and you are saying you are a free and independent nation and you are holding other countries to account on the issue of rights and holding their people accountable, you yourself must be held accountable yet. Mind you, now before 1980, 1979, there were other, pan-African, movements that have been established in South Africa. In South Africa, the students were also crying for liberation of their people. You go to Namibia, you go to Mozambique, Tanzania. These countries, in Ghana, Nkrumah was talking about, the unification of Africa. These were little things that are happening all around your continent. And it was just a matter of when that change was going to come. You couldn't have slept on the bed of, the bandwidth of change that it will not come.
So, Mr. Collins, from what I'm hearing from you, on the political side, you're more or less saying there was complete political monopoly. That's my terminology.
Absolute
the Congo hegemony control political power at the time.
Yes.
And even with that, they will not include, quote unquote, the indigenous to participate in the political process.
Yes.
And the progressives saw that as something that was unfair. Yes. And that they all of them as Liberians have owned the country equally.
Yes.
And so they then deserve equal political participation.
Absolutely.
So tell me what specific actions the progressive took to change that at the time.
They use a symbolic issue at the time.
Mm-hmm.
When the Toba administration, proposed to increase the price of rice.
Mm-hmm.
Rice being Liberia's staple food, the progressive movement used the issue of rice to rally the masses for not just rice or the economic conditions at the time, but for the issue of rights. Mind you now, There were certain people who could not have, attended university if you are quote unquote considered a native woman's son if you don't change your name. There was certain, I told you about the issue about how political leadership was distributed, the issue of the land, the question of the land, even the issue about, political involvement at the broad-based national level, who your father is and so forth. So what happened, the issue of April 14, 1979 was engineered by the Movement of Justice and Peace in Africa, MOJA.
Okay.
At the 5th anniversary of MOJA, MOJA had their 5th anniversary at the Sports Commission on Broad Street. That is where they had invited other, MOJA was basically, it was a political organization dealing with the political situation on a more broad-based spectrum in Africa, all of the different issues in Africa, while PA, being a progressive organization, was primarily focusing on the issues in the country. So MOJA had their issues, their anniversary, the 5th anniversary of MOJA. They have invited the head of the student, uprising in South Africa, Brother Cheshi Masinini. He was invited to come and give solidarity greetings. Dr. Famula was keynote speaker at the program of MOJA. So the late Brother Barcott Matthews used the opportunity that you people here in MOJA, if you are saying that all of these objective conditions, you have been marginalized with political leadership. MOJA has been saying to the True Win Party that you need to open up the democratic space. You cannot be condemning apartheid in South Africa when your own people here, you are marginalizing your people. You stand on no rights to question what is happening in South Africa. You cannot argue about the establishment of the OAU when you yourself, you have not managed to unify your people. So Matthew, being very crafty, saw it as an opportunity to initiate the conversation of April 14. He said, okay, if you are agitating, we'll call a protest on April 14, 1979. If you are angry, come out and join us. But I can refer you back to a beautiful, professor, a beautiful analysis one of the professors at the university wrote, Dr. Patrick Sayon. He wrote a beautiful analysis. He engineered and advised the True Win Party that it would be no good to increase the price of rice. He started the conversation. And that conversation from Dr. Patrick Sayon, became a more topical issue in the country. All over the masses were not happy with that. Some people will say, oh no, it was not just about food. They used the issue of the increasing price of rice as a symbolic representation. In fact, even right in the True Win Party, there were people who were disgruntled with Mr. Topper. They say he was quote unquote too liberal with these country people, and in the True Win Party, they had issues with Mr. Topper. There were different plots. There were people from the Topman faction who said, Topper was leaning more to opening mattress. Topper too was thinking, progressively. Was he an accident of this?
So Mr. Collins, on the issue of the rise, that you describe as it was more like a symbolic tool
right.
to echo, the issue about the people economic, standing at the time. Mm-hmm. There are some critics of the progressive that continue to say at the time,
right,
prices all around the world were on an upward spiral, meaning that basic commodity prices were increasing. Mm-hmm. There was some additional cost to production at the time.
Right.
And so the idea of, increasing the price of the rice was within some reasonable understanding. But right. The progressive were not reasonable. They saw that it was a way of further or strangulating the massive economically without looking at the facts. Others argue against the progressive. What do you have to say about that?
But let me throw the question back to you, brother Anthony C. If you are talking about the question of equal participation, who enjoyed monopoly in importing rice at the time? Wasn't it the brother of President Talbot?
So true.
So you must be honest here with the question of rice. So the True Win Party herself, they created a scheme where they could only raise, resources for herself. The only person at the time who could import rice, you want to run a competitive market. You must allow people the opportunity, other people who want to import rice. They must not just come from, the ballot of the Chewing Party. But at the time, it was only President Tobo family who could do rice. So there were different kinds of objective conditions. The people who will also make these kinds of flimsy excuses and say, oh, everything was okay, the country was developed. You come from Grand Creek County in Barclayville. Why is it today you don't have paved road to your county if everything was okay before 1980? The Chewing Party enjoyed one-party domineering rule for more than 100+ years. They could not have opened up the democratic space. Read your history book. What did it say about women participation in the politics? Up to how many years we, as a country, that Liberia could even pass on women voting in an election? Before you even vote in an election, you must own certain properties. Those were the kinds of backward tendencies you had in your country. Why do you see the emergence of Joseph Jenkins Rabo coming back again to serve another tenure after he was the first president of Liberia? It was the issue about right within their own cycle, segregation and marginalizing your people.
Mr. Collins, the critics of the progressive argue that the progressive were not patient enough because at some point Tobo was opening arms toward them gradually. Right. And some of them even argue Omen Tobo, who the progressive, were criticizing at the time, provided more scholarship. And in fact, it was during his administration, Liberia GDP rose to one of the highest in the world at the time. And so they could have exercised some restraint and who have had a peaceful or political ride through that period. But I mean, these were people who were like anxious. They wanted quick fixes at the time, and they didn't have the experience to even manage those kind of expectation.
No, you see, Brother C, let's be honest here. Let's look at Mr. Tobo. What was it? The progressive who engineered the coup? It was never the progressive class. The struggle of the country goes back on April 14, 1979, when the progressive decided to say, hey, a lot of things Mr. Tobo, if you've made, has been a sacrificial lamb on historical contradictions. He was vice president to Todman. I mean, of course, there was a lot of ills and injustice in the country. Over 40 traditional chiefs were executed on the Todman regime. Mm-hmm. He took over from he took over from Mr. Todman. The player at the time, who should have initially been the vice president to President Tobo?
Go ahead.
Let's reflect on historical accounts. Wasn't it a man from Nimba County that should have been the initial vice president to President Tobo? What happened overnight? How did the Chewing Party change the plan and brought one of the quote-unquote American Liberian, against the very same people who were calling for equal participation? Go and read the Buchanan Convention of the Chewing Party. Right after Mr. Tobo took over, they said that they should open up the country to democratic rule. Tobo people weren't happy about that. Go and read the account of Victoria Tobo. You had a protest on April 14, 1979. Aboput have begged Mr. Tobo that he have pleaded with the commissioner of police, the director of police at the time, the National Security Agency, that there will be no need, allow these people to come out in the street and protest. But the protesters were they throwing stones on April 14, 1979? No. They gathered in the streets of Monrovia. In fact, many of them were at power headquarters. They didn't even give them the opportunity to assemble in the streets. They were at power headquarters along the Galley Street, the UN draft area. The regime of Mr. Tobo besieged protesters, quote-unquote ordinary people. Google the day Monrovia stood still is an article written by Aboput. A veteran Liberian journalist have reminded the Tobo regime that you do not answer with violence with these people who are arguing for their democratic rights. That there is a need that you open up the country to democratic election, allow them to contest. These are the kinds of questions that Aboput were reminding the Tobo regime to. They didn't listen to Aboput. They say Aboput, he was so nice of a journalist because he could not write, for the right-wing forces at the time. They opened fire. They brought the army onto the street on April 14, 1979. Who do you consider? Who were in the army at the time when they brought people out in the street on April 14, 1979? The men and women in the army were ordinary people that they call, indigenous people's children. Those were people who were wearing uniform in the army. You brought the army.
Mr. Collins, critics of the.
Let me end on this note.
Okay.
You brought the army in the street on April 14, 1979. They answered with violence and inflicted casualty, leading to death of some of our comrades. Over 250 people died on April 14, 1979. The army opened fire. The police were very brutal of Mr. Talbot. The very people you call onto the street April 14, 1979, you had control of the army at the time. Why did you lose control of the very same army on April 12, 1980, when Sergeant Doe announced to the world that a coup have taken place, that the old two imparted government of over 100 years has been overthrown? The very same people, the very same army you brought onto the street, the very first people to call onto the army for democratic rule was the student movement, the progressive community. The Student Unification Party had the guts. In fact, right after Sergeant Doe took over, in less than 3 months, the students held a press conference with the likes of Comrade World Tapia and said to Mr. Doe, that's Master Sergeant, that there is a need to turn the country you transition the country to what? To civilian rule.
Mr. Collins, Mr. Collins, yeah. And that's the criticism, critics of the progressive continue to make that, look, the progressive, they had their intellectual imprint or fingerprint on the conscious members of the society, on the university campus, and even the military, because they were forceful in their critique of the Talbot, and then the Talbot administration first of all, and then the Talbot. And so when these military personnel felt the need to act, they were indirectly acting upon the messages that came from the progressive, that all is just bad in this country.
You need to go and read there's a professor at Harvard University. I'll probably send his name to you. He wrote an analysis, and he claimed in that report that the overthrow of President Talbot was engineered by the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency. Even the account of Victoria Talbot argued that she saw quote-unquote white hands in the death of Talbot. She said it was not this. You want us to believe that, those enlisted men in the army headed by Sergeant Doe and the other brothers in the army stormed the executive mansion overnight and took power? Could it be possible that it was just not, the CIA that has some involvement? Mr. Talbot have involved himself into a regional politics with Yasser Arafat of the Middle East.
But the thing, Mr. Collins, that lingers is that let's agree for the sake of, hold on, Mr. Collins, let's agree for the sake of argument that the CIA or some world power-led, America has some hand in it. Who do you think they will have turned power over to? I mean, wouldn't they have engineered this thing to the extent that Sergeant Doe would say, hey, because if they had the influence on Sergeant Doe, or if they have worked with Sergeant Doe and some members of the military, don't you think they would have instructed them like, hey, you are just here to complete this task and turn it over to the progressive?
Do you know that the foreign minister of President Talbot was denied asylum when he went to the U.S. Embassy, Cesar Dennis? After the coup took place on Moravia's soil, he was the Minister of Foreign Affairs. He sought asylum to the U.S. Embassy. On what grounds that happened, we don't know. But what I'm saying to Mr. Talbot have gotten himself involved with the issue in the Middle East. He was involved into Middle Eastern politics. I told you about his relationship with Yasser Arafat.
Yes.
The progressives at the time, they were not concerned about that. They were concerned about equal participation. Talbot being the man he is, if you like, you can say he was a victim of historical circumstances. Why do you think that international powers were comfortable with President Talbot, who led the country for more than 20-something years? Nobody had the time to question Mr. Talbot.
So you seem to be holding Talbot accountable. You seem to be holding Talbot responsible for what happened to him. It was because he has more like turned his back to the U.S. and was talking to other powers that were completely enemies to the U.S.
No, I mean, if Mr. Tobo did what he did, I mean, the rest is history. You can call that. But you see, the dynamics of international politics, and Dr. Formula touched this at the TRC hearing, that there are no permanent friends in international politics. Strategic interests. Look, we have read different accounts of how the CIA engineered plots in different countries. If the CIA want to engineer a coup in Liberia, you think they will go for men in the army to go and execute such operation? They operate with different kinds of special agents. They will not go and men will come and announce he's Sergeant Doe and this and that and the third. No, that whatever calculation that happened, we cannot go and bring the cops of Sergeant Doe to tell us what happened. But Victoria Toba is yet to be convinced that Toba at the time, were executed on the hands of Doe and his men. In fact, at some point, you read her account, she said she did see white hair. It is possible too that Madame Toba didn't see white hair because she said the room was dark. You close your eyes, is all darkness. You open your hand, the first thing that comes is bright light. So Toba was a sacrificial lamb. And history does not understand good intention. You can have good intention for your wife, Brother C. But if you don't transform your good intention into positive action, your wife will not see that you love her. You say, oh, I was thinking about taking you out, on a date. Did you take your wife out? Have you checked the historical pages? There were mayor elections that should have been scheduled. Why did the Chewing Party cancel the mayor election? It was clear that Dr. Amos Sawyer was going to win the election hands down. The Chewing Party knew at the time that the progressive were not in a rush or a hurry. They were calling on a democratic space. They were calling on equal participation. They have moved to establish their political party, Moja. They were taking you democratically hands on. But what happened to the Chewing Party? You have used the power all your life over more than 100 plus years. And the way you thought that you could maintain power was to be, answer with violence and suppress people. And we still see the very vices.
Mr. Collins, fast forward, the PRC came in, and we saw the progressive, they initiated some form of efforts.
Right.
My recollection is that Commander Wisa read a petition for Sergeant Doe to return to democratic rule.
Yes.
And are you saying that the progressive were not that sophisticated enough to have mounted significant pressure to ensure that which they have embarked on? Because what we saw later, they joined ranks with Doe and they took up positions in the government. I mean, couldn't they have stood their ground and said, no, Sergeant Doe, it's not going to work. You're not going to rule this country?
No, you see, you must be careful here. You are in a country where young men who have just gotten out of the country, very educated, they were, of course, they could meet the challenge. Whether you want to deal with the question of experience, these were young men who were educated and experienced. At the time, you want to go back to Matthews. Matthews used to be a cadet at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He didn't just come out to be Backward Matthews, as you know him to be. These were young professionals who were basically learning mainstream government. There are times they were educated young men. They were prepared. But again, Mr. Toba and the Chewing Party, they weren't prepared. So you say you take power, the military take over. They have just announced on national television that they have overthrown a president and the president is dead and everybody should return to status quo. And they call you who are agitating for political power. Do you know that many of the progressive brothers didn't even know that they were appointed in the government until they heard it on the radio? You reject an appointment from a military regime? Where will you stay to struggle? Sergeant Doe, he announced his cabinet. He announced Dr. Formula as Minister of Education. He announced Brother Backward Matthews. He announced Tipote. He brought most of these people in. But when he appointed them in government, that is not where the struggle ends, because you have few.
Mr. Collins, that is what the critics have on the progressive. They could have stood their ground to say, Mr. Doe, if it means that you're going to assassinate us, go ahead and do it. We're not going to work with you, because the manner informed in which Sergeant Doe we've been made to believe carry on the assassination of William Aratoba was not a democratic process. And so for them to have, for some reason, agree to this process and try to be part of it as a way of moving the country forward, they were treading on the dangerous path. Don't you see so? That's what critics are saying.
Brother Anthony.
Yes.
You are dealing with group of military men here for the most part. You know, educational with no disrespect to some of them, semi-illiterates. You want to rationalize with men who are holding guns and say, we are appointing you in government. You know, Sergeant Doe used to have this thing in the country called effective immediate. So you see, and that is why we say to people who held power before 1980, even when the quote-unquote country people took over power, the progressive didn't stop talking. They didn't just start asking critical questions. It was not about putting an end to American Liberian rule. The very first people to call for turning the country to civilian rule was the progressive, the student movement. You just reminded me, Brother Commoner, we said read a statement. He was president of LINSU. So when they call, do you know that when they had that protest to ask Sergeant Doe to step aside, the Doe regime answered with violence, they beat comrades and the police started to shoot in the air? It was when you saw the exiting of progressive people from the Doe regime. Dr. Famula resigned as Minister of Foreign Affairs. There were other brothers who were sent to firing squad in Belayala. The likes of, Comrade Alaric Togba. You want to reference a man like Professor Alaric Togba, rather. Professor Togba, Ezekiel Pajibo, and all these brothers, these are men who survived Belayala prison. The military were very clear that student leaders was going to be executed by firing squad.
Were they executed?
Well, we don't know the rest of the history. Mr. Doe went...
Darlington, here's the thing. Right. Sergeant Doe was bluffing. Hold on, brother. Sergeant Doe was bluffing because this is what I'm trying to process here.
But you cannot
hold on, Darlington. How could the progressive...
military regime could do?
Yeah, hold on now. How could the progressive...
Right.
stood against Omen Totman?
Right.
He was a dictator.
Mm-hmm.
By every definition.
Mm-hmm.
Togba came into the picture. I know other people will say he was progressive, but all the tenets of dictatorship, we could see it. He was nepotistic, and they began their opposition against him.
Right.
And then Samuel Doe, who happened to be more like a son of the progressive. The progressive will cower into him. Were they cowards?
The progressive.
That's the question I'm asking.
The progressive didn't cower into submission. You see, when you are dealing with political systems here, you first want to understand, was the coup popular with the broad-based masses of the people? Yes, it was. The masses at the time, they were happy that Sergeant Doe have stormed power and taken over. These people have lived in fear for years under the Chewing Party. They couldn't speak out for themselves. It took the progressive to start to ask the critical question. Open multi-party. It is off the backs of the progressive struggle now that we even have the opportunity to keep such conversation. The establishment of different political parties. How they are governing today, the rest we can debate. But you see, the coup was popular with the people. What was the slang in Morovia? Native woman, born soldier, Congo woman, born bro. The masses saw it as an opportunity that they have moved into history. Like any country, most African countries that have succeeded, the military took over. When they're disciplined military men, look at Ghana, a man called Jerry Rawlings. The military took over. See, after a counter coup, they led the country into a civilian rule. So what I want you to understand here is that the progressive at the time, while Sergeant Doe have taken power, you didn't give Sergeant Doe an opportunity to show to the masses as to whether if he is a dictator or he's offered, the tenets of democracy. You couldn't have judged Sergeant Doe on the basis of taking over. Anybody who have been, marginalized and kept depressed for a long time. Let me put it this way. Is that
the criticism, Darlington, is that the progressive made a conscious decision for what you just explained. Well, these were military men that had taken over. They had guns in their hand. And to add to that point that you are making earlier, during that period, military coups were the order of the day to change government. And so that phenomenon was strong, more so, like you rightly said, it was the action by Sagido and others was very popular with the masses. The masses wanted a change at the time.
Yes.
But again, Darlington, let me say again, the progressive knew that though was not sophisticated to govern. And so they needed to have done a better job in trying to guide him. But they felt that he was the man, and they let him to become a man of his own. And so he dominated them when it came to governance.
The progressive did provide guidance for Sergeant Doe. If you look at
Democrat, for how long?
For as much as he wanted to be guided for, until he started to chase progressive people into exile. Until he felt threatened that he wasn't willing to give up power. That he felt that he had big backers. He felt that he was, Sergeant Doe came here to the US, welcome on red carpet. He felt that regardless of who, and this is the contradiction and the arrogance of national leaders. When they feel that, they have big powers that endorse their struggle or their whatever, they tend to disrespect everything that is happening in the country. Sergeant Doe, like I said, you couldn't have judged Sergeant Doe just for the fact that he have a military takeover. Is that a hungry man who rejects the opening of store for free food? For more than 100 years, you ran a political system where you subjected the people to all forms of hardship, depraved living conditions. Why do you think that they created those places called Nugu Town, where I come from, Claro Town? How many of the land your family have today in Morovia? Brother, see, you think of it. The only place they reserve for quote-unquote poor people's children were family. With little consciousness, of course, you're not giving us sufficient in terms of developing those land. You talk about, look at how the whole city of Morovia was built. Like it was built for some 500 persons. So you couldn't have start getting issues with Sergeant Doe. Sergeant Doe took over. What did the student movement do? Remind Sergeant Doe that if you do intend to be president, you need to return this country to civilian rule, meaning the military need to go back to the barracks and turn this country to democratic rule. So even after Sergeant Doe took over, I will agree with you. Did the progressives stop talking? They didn't stop talking. It was not about a struggle about undoing the American Liberians or the quote-unquote Congo people. Even within the indigenous sons of our people today, I come from Grand Crew. The current President George Weah, is from Grand Crew County. I remain one of his critics. I believe that he's not serious for national transformation. I also believe that he's diverting state resources to his personal use. I share those thoughts and ideas. I don't believe that he's a serious man. So the progressive struggle, it just didn't end on April 14, 1979. It will not end. The struggle for transforming our country for the better, the country have seen all kinds of backward leaders, true. Some of them, they are backward native people's children. They are good Congo people too as well. But you see, you cannot judge us of the problems of the Tobo regime. You don't blame us for that. Go back, read a different account of the TRC. See how the killing of David Coleman, only because he was talking about justice and liberty. The exiling of the different comrades. Who asked the question on Sergeant Doe? How did a man called Tonian Richardson, Wiwi Deba, Wo Kapitapia, how these brothers were killed? Have we asked the question today? How their families are feeling? And when we talk about April 14, people want to present the coup of the 13 men as more significant. They killed 13 people.
Yeah, we'll come back to that.
Shot over 250 ordinary poor people's children from depraved communities. I think that is where the struggle is, and that is the question we should deal with.
Yes, we're going to deal with that question. Thank you there, Mr. Darlington calling folks in cyberspace. This is Focus on Liberia. We are having a special edition on Focus on Liberia here concerning April 14, 1979. We are trying to look at some historical facts of the progressive struggle. My guest is Mr. Darlington Calling, and we are taking a retrospective analysis. Welcome. If you are just joining us, we want to welcome you to the very critical discussion about the history of Liberia, what went wrong in the past, the activism of the progressive, Mr. Collins, let me bring you back in. Let me read some comments. Then we will come to why is it today in Liberia? Everybody tried to talk about the 13 men, and people don't want to talk about the 250,000. They don't treat the death of 250,000 person more significant. They think that 13 men, for the way they position their argument, that the 13 men, death or execution is the greatest sin ever in the history of Liberia. When we look at the pages of history, we can talk about the war in the southeast, crew chiefs that have been slaughtered, and you can talk about more people that have been killed. We will talk about that, but let's bring in some comments, and then we'll come to that issue. Let's hear from His Eminent Emmanuel S. Watty. It was Coming with who read the petition for Doe to return to democratic rule. His Eminent, thank you for your contribution there. And I hear from Dave Giga. He said, even if the PRC had overthrown the TWP, it would have been justified. Change was inevitable. Tobo was a victim of his own sinister behavior and shenanigan. Wow.
Chicanery.
Chicanery, sorry. Thank you. Chicanery. Let's hear from Vasiki Kane. Tobo was the most progressive president at the time. He was the victim of circumstances. He died for the sins of the 100+ years of one-party oppressive rule. Do you have some agreement there before we continue?
I agree with Big Brother Nivasiki Kone. If you like, Tobo was a sacrificial lamb. And history didn't have the luxury of time to wait for Mr. Tobo. The change was just so inevitable that whether the PRC could have taken power, that there was a huge, a point of contention, political contention in the country at the time. Was it a matter of when or how? Of course. I mean, the two-win party couldn't have held on to power even up to now. They were losing grips on power.
All right. Let's hear from Va Basso King. Are you saying the progressives were not prepared to die for the right thing they were fighting for? That person is asking me a question because I put you on that. Let me progress with the comments. Let's hear from Dave Jai again. The progressives were compromised under Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, though. They caved into Ellen's corruption. You will elaborate on that later on after we give you the opportunity to address the issue of the 13 men, versus the chiefs that were killed versus the 250,000. All right, let's hear from Ningo C. Kofi. Vasiki Conan, true, but his death was masterminded by the very true We Party. Well, the argument here is deep, my brother. Tannen Patricia Lewis. Yoke, please come. Okay, calling somebody. That is not significant right now. Dave Ja, a hardened sinner cannot die for sinners. Tobo was an embodiment of cronyism, nepotism, and hypocrisy. He was deeply immoral. I agree 100%. This guy was just going all over the country. He had all the wives. He had all the concubines. Don't even get me started, Dave. Vasiki again. You cannot blame the progressive for those insatiable desire for power. Though was put in power by the CIA to undercut the efforts of the progressive. Whoa, what did the progressive do for which the US CIA would not be in their favor? The brothers at the time were educated. He said one Gab Tapper was killed during the war. One Gab Tapper was killed during the war. All right. That is Lina Bonga. To build Liberia, we must unite as one people, but we must also tell the history. Because Bacchus said he informed Tobo about a plot to overthrow him, and Tobo confirmed being aware. Now, people are bringing us some information here. Liberia needs innovative leaders other than political parties. So, Mr. Collins, few comments there. Let's start with this question about 13 men being treated more so as being the only deaths that were gruesome, that really served this country on a political peril. Some people would make that argument versus crew chiefs and other chiefs, other indigenous that were massacred. And, people don't want to talk about that. And then we'll talk about a 250,000. You and myself share something in common. Ground crew, the guy who is the president is our brother. This guy claimed to love Liberia. 250,000 died also, but we'll come to that. Let's address this issue about the 13 men. Go ahead.
I read the front page and passively the editorial of Front Page Africa.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to use this opportunity to say to Front Page Africa and Rodney CA that we as students of history have an opportunity to take a deep glance of who are writing for the people and who are anti-people. We have an opportunity to say to Mr. Rodney CA that your analysis is not very true in the Front Page Africa. It is an attempt to change the narrative of the people's struggle. Mr. Rodney CA captioned his April 12, 2021, edition of his Front Page Africa by saying, "Curse nation, curse is on the land," recounting an eyewitness who shared her experience and said, the shooting of Manlopu Flomo, according to the Rodney CA Front Page Africa. Whether that is verifiable, that is up for debate. Rodney CA writes that the killing of the 13 men on Paul began the curse on the nation. But that is not true, Mr. Rodney CA. You need to probably go and grab the editorial of the Informer, the Daily Observer newspaper, rather. The Daily Observer newspaper reminds us in her April 13 edition that the problem of Liberia being a curse, it was not the shooting of the 13 men on April 12, 1980. It goes back to the exiling of a man called E.W. Blyden. The over 250 indigenous people, children on April 14, 1979, that was shot into the street. The brother like Robert Zia, who was shot into the head. The very first casualty on April 14, 1979. The exiling of different comrades into exile. Even on the very same two-wing party, the marginalizing and segregating of your people. So you want to downplay it if you want to play the number game. You saw Mr. Todman how over 40 traditional leaders were executed unjustifiably on Mr. Todman. Are you saying that the families of those chiefs aren't they injured too? Yes, they are injured. Are you saying that the over 250 poor people's children, in fact, the two-wing party buried them in mass graves? The families today do not even know where their graves are. The military took over. I mean, in any historical context or analysis, any military takeover, there will be minor contradictions. So it was with the PRC regime. If you ask me personally, if Dr. Famula said this at the TRC hearing, that if he was in the meeting where Sergeant Doe, was advised, it was not even 13. When the PRC took over, they had enlisted over 68 former officials of the Children Party. They wanted to know where the officials were, whether they posed any threat to a counter coup. So it was about keeping surveillance on people of the old regime. So the 13 men, these were people who were considered to, the military put them on a tribunal through a military. It was under a military regime. The military tried them the way they did. Under military law. I'm not a member of the army. Do I feel sorry for the family who, lost their friends and their loved ones on April 12, 1980? I pity you. I feel sorry for your loved one. No, it is only inhuman that a human being will not feel the suffering of another human being. We pity you too. But what we are saying here, the likes of Rodney CA, other people who write for right-wing enclaves, stop pointing accusing fingers at the army or the progressive struggle for the execution of these 13 men. We too, on the flip side, you think we are not sharing tears for the over 250 people who lost their lives unjustifiably on April 14, 1979? Their families want to see the graves of their loved one, but they do not have it today. 250. They are even more significant as opposed to 13 men. I mean, the 13 men, they were old men. You find out today that some of these men, you just keep a little surveillance on it. There's no need to put them on a pool. Just let these people, go and meet their maker in peace. But the army did the way they did. I mean, military people take over. So it's the nature of any armed conflict and struggle. People died justifiably, unjustifiably. We paid what happened on April 12, 1980. But we feed the grief and the hurt, and we don't make apology because the Chewing Party fell on April 12, 1980 when the military took over. Our people have been suppressed for years. Students have been chased, beaten.
Mr. Collins, the death of the 13 men,
yes,
the death of the 13 men is equally troubling as the death of chiefs that were executed in Liberia. We're talking about indigenous chiefs, as well as the 250 persons that lost their life when Sirleaf and Charles Taylor and others launched an onslaught on our dear country. Everybody equally important here. So the idea that people saying, oh, it was this April 14, the killing of the 13 men, I should put it here, really set this country on this spiral is completely false. Is that what you're saying?
It is false, and it is a distortion of historical analysis. Mm-hmm. Because these 13 men, they were members of the Toba cabinet at the time. They could have reflect on Aberport's article when he advised them, meet up with the protesters, do not shoot them, give them the police marching band, allow them. The Constitution says that they have the right at all times to assemble in the street and petition their government.
So true.
But Mr. Toba, he didn't listen. These men too, they were members of President Toba's cabinet. In fact, at the tribunal, they said Toba was weak. Some of the very same Chewing Party people, some of them, they were in Toba regime. They were sycophants. They play all kinds of, they were scheming on President Toba. They didn't advise him. And that is why when you are in political leadership, you need to be receptive to counter view. You need to, to listen to other people, even if they disagree with you, regardless of their analysis. Had the Chewing Party listened on April 14, 1979, probably the political narrative of our country could have been different. But you answer with violence. The very same men you brought, they used to call those military men Nokos. The very same Nokos you brought onto the street to wreak terror on her own people. It's like the dog turning against the owner, and you want us to sit down here and share crocodile tears because the very same dogs you are keeping in the army. I don't mean that with disrespect. I mean that in terms of analysis, right? Mm-hmm. The very army you brought onto the street to teach these people a lesson, to teach these ordinary people's children a lesson. Beat them. In fact, their parents do not even have money to take them to funeral home. We put them in mass grave. They turn up against it 1 year after. They land you on the poor. We sorry for the family who were hurt, but we too on the flip side.
All right.
We are even more hurting about that.
And Mr. Collins, thank you. So
our companies today, their families cannot even locate where they are buried. We too want to have memorial service. If you give us the opportunity today in Monrovia, April 14, we too want to memorialize these comrades who died.
Thank you. Thank you. Again, folks, you are watching Focus on Liberia. This is a special broadcast, by the way. On April 14, 1979, we are taking a retrospective look at the historical facts concerning the progressive struggle, because there is a huge portion of Liberians who blame the progressive for the political and governance trajectory of Liberia, that their advocacy at the time led us to April 14 and then the wars that follow. And so Darlington Collins, having been a follower of the progressive, who believe in the progressive, is here to sharpen the contradiction, as Liberian intellectuals will say. And so, folks, Mr. Collins, before I bring in callers to join the conversation, and so folks, get ready. I'll be sharing a number quite soon for you to participate. So the progressive, in your opinion, stood tall against the vices that were in the faces of the Liberian people, from Todball and then to Todman, and then to a greater extent, though
Yes.
But like Dave Judd wrote earlier, but this very progressive, according to him, cave in to Ellen Johnson Sirleaf and the very excessive secret killings and all that.
I don't know
Corruption. Let me land, Mr. Collins. Let me land. All that was like, at the forefront in the Ellen Johnson Sirleaf administration, but these very progressive were quiet. Even your godfather. I mean, sorry if I will offend you by saying that your godfather HB was like in the pocket of Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. He was the national security advisor. Hold on, yeah, I know this been to a greater extent too. Jefferson Campbell is HB right-hand political son. So is Pete Seyantuba. I am a godson to these individuals. Family could not get Seyantuba on a payroll in Ellen Johnson Sirleaf administration, even though he was the national security advisor. In fact, Ellen told the national security agency and shop it on the Ministry of Presidential Affairs. Family have no voice. He was voiceless throughout. So confirming what Dave said. What do you say to that?
We can have a day to come and talk about Dr. Famula's involvement in the politics. I don't want to zero in on that, but I can respond to specifics. Let me say here a few things. When a country has been ravished by over 14 years of civil upheaval, in 2005, you went to an interim arrangement, you transitioned in conducting your first special election. On the time, in fact, people, I don't know how people can do historical reflection. In 2005, the progressive didn't support Ellen. You need to reflect. The progressive at the time organized into the APD, the Alliance for Peace and Democracy.
I remember that very well. I supported the APD. I supported that group.
They presented the question of ideas to you in 2005. They said, we want, they submitted a platform to you, the progressive, they brought forth themselves for political leadership. What did you do with these young men? Or, what did you do with these ideas? At the time, the country zeroed in on supporting Mr. Sirleaf and President Weah. The political sensation at the time. You know book, you don't know book, I will vote for you. That was the narrative. So why in this country we have always had the question about political slang? The elections have never been about the issues. When Sergeant Doe took over, Native woman born soldier, Congo woman born rule in 2005. You know will vote for you. You zero down the country to a second runner-up with Mr. Sirleaf and President Weah. You expected a man like Dr. Famula, who has spent years in the classroom, to support a semi-electorate like President Weah. Dr. Famula supported Mr. Weah at the time and made him president. What possible difference could have been? You see why the progressive didn't rally around the options you gave to them at the time with Mr. Weah? The best option at the time was Mrs. Sirleaf. I remain one of her strong critics. Mrs. Sirleaf took over. She was on a pedestal of reconciling the war. Liberia.
The progressive were even divided. For you to flow on this, the progressive were even divided. Darlington or Dr. Tipote supported Weah in the second round. Dr. Tipote supported Weah in the second round, and HB went by way of Ellen.
You didn't speak with support. You spoke about joining Mrs. Sirleaf, right? Dr. Tipote was appointed by Mrs. Sirleaf at Division 2030. Dr. Sawyer at some point with the governance commission. So I want to deal with this question holistically, right? So you see now, Mr. Weah, he has power. You see, he has power. Mr. Weah has power. Mr. Sirleaf, you cannot argue unarguably with all of the minor contradictions with Mr. Sirleaf. In her first year, Mr. Sirleaf managed the country very well until the returning of her son, Robert Sirleaf, in her second term.
Did you say minor contradiction? Minor?
No, I'm saying with all of the major contradictions, there will always be major contradictions. Yeah, let me clarify that. Yeah, thank you for fact checking that. With all of the issues, but I am of the strongest conviction that Mrs. Sirleaf, in her first tenure, she performed exceptionally well. That gave her a second mandate for a second tenure. It was about, people say that the formula was in the pocket of Mrs. Sirleaf. Dr. Formula remained the only public official, even up to today's date, who retained. Do you know that the ministry, the Office of National Security Advisor, is under the Ministry of State for Presidential Affairs? He controls his own budget. He was the only man who always remit funds back to the government, funds that he did not use. It was not about wealth or material gains. It was about moving a country forward that had been ravished for over 14 years of civil war. You wanted the progressive to start speaking of another struggle after you have come from war and you elected a democratic regime. It was a question about serving your country. And as much as I despise Mr. Weah, the singular honor that every man wants in his lifetime is to serve his country. If Mr. Weah asks me now and say, Darlington, I think you can play a meaningful role when he has just taken over. I'm not saying it right now. Can you hear such and such? That is the singular honor. Every man wants to serve their country. What I do when I stay in leadership, if Mr. Weah is backward, I resigned. Didn't you listen to that formula in government criticizing the Allen regime? He did. But you see, when you are certain places in national security, you manage how you talk. Because when you don't talk again now at the point as more activists, the students, the progressive movement, a man like Alaric Togba, you want to, so we must not elevate one progressive over the other. But Alaric Togba despised Mr. Salif. Dr. Tipote resigned at some point from the Vision 2030. He have issues with Mr. Salif. So progressive have always been talking. They weren't paying pocket pay on the regime of Mr. Salif. It was about moving a country forward. It was about, social transformation and progress. So this is where we are. Even now today, the struggle for social justice and peace and freedom still continues. Even under Mr. Weah regime, the students are always been agitating. The comrades from the Student Unification Party. The brothers, you find in the NDC, the brothers from the LPP, a man like Brother Tiawan Gonglo, a man like a Dr. Dubayan, a Liberian, medical expert who have used his expertise in offering service to his country. You must give it to him. These are brothers who are thinking positively, and we must pay tribute to these brothers.
Mr. Collins, we have a caller. Let me bring that caller in. Caller, your name and where you're joining us from.
Hi, my name is Eastman. I'm calling from Washington, D.C. Hello, Mr. Collins, and hello, Mr. Sia.
How are you, Brother Eastman?
I'm doing great. Yes. Go ahead.
Okay, so here's my question. What we've seen that throughout times people try to separate Liberian people as being two opposing cultures, that of the native and that of the Congo. However, that cannot be any further from the truth, because what we have are the haves and the have-nots. We are a mixed culture. There's no Liberian without the other Liberian. So where we see people driving a wedge between us, we've ignored the fact that the difference between us is who has money and who does not. And we have seen that most, if not the majority of Liberian people, they wish to be counted among those who have money, those who are affluent. Because by changing the administration, and you have not changed the culture of the people, that is who crave to have wealth, who crave to have honor and to be served, you have done nothing. My question is, what were the progressives doing to change the perspective and culture of the root culture of Liberian people, so they will not look at riches and grandeur as something to be attained, rather nationhood?
Thank you. Go ahead, Darlington.
The brother asked a very, very, very good question. What have the progressive accomplished is not going after riches for nationhood. The progressives are one of probably the most selfless people in Monrovia you will ever meet. You cannot, I challenge the history, you cannot single out a single member of the progressive class who have been named, labeled, indicted in any acts of corruption. In fact, that is why, people manage to disrespect them and vilify them. You are not a progressive man because of the color of the big house he built. You are not a progressive man because of the number of students he has impacted in society. You are not a man is progressive by the way he impacts his community. The question about segregation has been the question that was introduced by the Chewing Party. The question of wealth. Brother Anthony, land is so much of a great asset. Have you asked yourself the question when you look in Monrovia and surrounding areas? Who are the families that own those properties? The Chewing Party run from corruption. Some of them took loan from the various government and acquired those properties. The government was then renting, land ministry and agencies from their own people. We were basically, you were building a class system in terms of economic disparity. Show me before 1980, which one of the indigenous son that was a rich man that made it to the top in business? The only way
we understand D12 was a rich man.
I mean, where can you find Brother D12 properties? Show me where. You need a school in Newtown in his honor that the sea is probably eroding on today. He said that is the cause of this historical distortion. Show me where the D12 family collect rent properties from. The people who own most parts of the country. You cannot discuss serious national reconciliation when you came out of captivity from slavery, basically. You went to the country. You met indigenous people on the land. You encroached on their land. You built for yourself wealth. You left their people depraved. You kept the communities underdeveloped. You are building a class system. You want to talk. These are and when you look at the recommendation of the TROC, there cannot be any true reconciliation in the absence of economic equalities or immense economic inequalities. You cannot reconcile a country. You see it. Look in the country. The only place some of us only our family. If you put my whole family, we probably have not acquired more than 10 acres of land, maybe 5 acres.
Well, I think your family should have more than that in Grand Cru, except you want it in Monrovia.
Because you see, they created this mindset, that the buffers could only acquire land in Grand Cru County. And the McLeans could own land on Randall Street. That is the kind of class system. But we have transitioned that. The history have passed that. But again, some of these properties that were acquired on a fictitious means, these properties need to be turned over back to the state. You cannot, a single family cannot own more than 25 acres of land. How did you acquire that land? Who was the presiding judge in such civil court when you acquired that land? You ran a very close country. It was just about certain family. Before 1847, there were certain people who could hold on to political leadership. You come from a particular church, a particular family. You know these things, brother. See it?
Yes, I know. And the one, Mr. Collins,
the only hotspot they care for us is the one we have in Newtown, the one they have in Claratown. And then you say, okay, let's reconcile.
Mr. Collins, the one that when I'm reading history,
right?
The one that when I'm reading history, that always have my head shaking like this is the Talbot. When I look at the brother's government,
right,
you could literally count pretty close to 30 Talbots in his government, and that did not bother him. And as though that were not enough, if you look at businesses in the country at the time, he nearly was into the Talbot family was nearly into every major business at the time.
Price, everything.
So they were not only controlling political power, they were controlling the economic power of the country. And so when folks sit by and say, oh, this man was progressive, and then you come to how socially he was corrupt. That guy was going around, he would take just about any young girl.
No, but satisfy
his sexual desire.
And
it was okay. And many of these things were done against the will of these people. But it was the culture that they had created at the time, that if you are a native person and you needed to survive, you needed to give up your rights just to get some crumbs dropping from the table of the elite class at the time. And so, I was trying to hold back myself in this conversation, but I am a Liberian too. We are talking about the injustices of the past, how a certain group of people were marginalized, not only politically, but they were also being marginalized economically, and their rights were being trampled upon in so many ways. So, Mr. Collins, again, you are right. I must agree. The history is there for us to see. But let's come to this now. We have to close. This has happened. Our progressive fathers, let me put it that way, wanted to see this day that a Namwe, a Sie, a Wia, a Yakpawuro, a Buffer, who be at the legislature, who be a minister. And that's one of the things they advocated for. And not only that, they wanted to see transparency. They wanted to see them not amassing wealth like the old order did, but today here we are. Have we disappointed the progressive?
The political leadership have disappointed the progressive struggle. And let me say this to you, Brother CA, that, the torch of social justice and agitation will not stop burning until our country fall in love with the right person. If you have been in love before and you have been treated all sort of way, let me put it this way: a woman fall in love with a man, and the man treats her so poorly, it doesn't stop that sister to still have an opportunity to fall in love. One day, that woman will find that man who is going to treat her with honor and respect. So it's with the progressive struggle. We love our country. It's like a young man who takes a beautiful wife to an altar. She's fine, nice looking in the veil. When the pastor read all of the different, spiritual and religious, rites, or the imam, you say, yes, you do. And even if that wife of yours get older, you still love her. That's how we love our country. That is why, regardless of who is in the executive mansion, regardless of your indigenous or your Americo-Liberian heritage or your traditional background, it does not matter. It does not matter the question of a man, tribe, his race, his religion. When I look at you, Anthony, I should see you a Liberian citizen first. I do not care as to whether you're a crew man. That's immaterial. If I look at, a steward, for example, the first thing that clicked to mind is that he's a Liberian citizen. I don't try to establish his origin with Americo-Liberian. That is nonsense. There are decent indigenous people. There are backward decent people. Indigenous people too as well. It's both sides of the coin. So as we move forward, the issue of Mr. Weah, you see, the loudest voice today, who making noise on Mr. Weah? It's the very same poor people's children. But do not quantify the errors of the indigenous people today and say that the country people cannot lead the country. Because you have only tested them with power for a brief while. I'm not saying that you cannot, if you want to revert to the old order, the same thing you had over 100 years, do so. But you cannot look at Mr. Weah's misbehavior in government, his clamping down on free speech, and people getting messy under the cover of darkness, and you say that we will not ask these critical questions. We will not stop talking. Brother C, some of his friends, the guys he has as junior ministers in his cabinet, in his government, some of them, they are my friends. We were comrades. But what unified us at the time was the people's interest. Now that they have deviated, that's where we draw the line, regardless of who you are. I don't care who is president of the country. What I'm concerned about is that whoever we have as president of the country promotes human dignity and treat all people with respect. We must put the resources at the disposal of our people. We must reconcile our country. We must establish educational facilities and empower our people, train them in agriculture, and do not just subject them to, to native reserve Batustan's. You keep them in these kinds of shackles.
Mr. Collins, finally, like you, I must say, I am a big fan of the progressive.
Thank you.
I believe that 99% of the criticism and the critiques against them are baseless and half-cooked logic. But I too, like those who criticize them, have my strong criticism about them.
True.
That
and
is
before you go further,
their lukewarmness coming to this critical period in our history to remain partially silent and physically non-visible. I have had the opportunity, to have listened to Dr. George Clequier when Delia Marcel had him here on the history series. And in the backstage, I was just wondering, and I asked him a question. I said, "But Dad, why you can't continue this?" And he said, "The politics in Liberia is about personality. It's about who is popular. It is not about ideas. And some of us, we are not wired that way." And and that was an honest answer, but I would not take that. You know why I would not take that? No. Because I'm a village boy. When I'm going to get palm nut, because we the Kru people survive from palm butter. When the river is full,
right,
I can't turn my back because the river is full. I will find a way to cross that river to get across, to get to that palm tree to call it, because my sister, my mother is relying on me as the other son in the family to bring that palm nut to town. It is essential. But for the progressive to look at the political landscape and see, oh, it's clouded, it's noisy, there's too much noise in our ears, and almost like they have withdrawn, it disappoints me to the greater extent. And then one more thing is that what I see is that they only want to rely on their intellectual power and excellence to drive the masses. And the masses are not where they are mentally. Let me give you another example, and this is why you're going to close with. Look at Costa. My disagreement with Costa is his language. The guy is eloquent, but he, for some reason, chooses to use vile language at times, and he justifies that is it the only language, brother, we understand. That is unacceptable. I don't believe that. But what I'm saying is, this is a brother. Whatever you think of him, have found that will to connect to the masses. A Darius DeLong, who cannot match the intellectual power of the progressive, has found a way to connect with the masses. So what is wrong with the progressive? Why can't the progressive say, okay, if we cannot be the face, those who are our followers, can we pull a team together and use one of them so that we can see and achieve what we have dreamed? I don't think when they were dreaming that they needed to be there. They were dreaming for a Liberia, that their young brothers and sisters coming after them will be able to thrive and realize their full potential. That is my criticism. Your response will be your closing statement, and then we'll be out of here. Go for it.
You see, Brother C, let me go back to your analogy. When you go to the village, and no matter how the river is full, you say you attempt to cross the river because your family needs palm oil and they need to be fed. That is true. But it is reckless bravery to attempt to cross the river when the town people says to you at a certain hour of the day, you dare not put Kino on the river. And you're a Kino man, you're a fisherman. You know what I'm talking about. When the people have warned you to say the river at this hour of the day is dangerous, do not attempt to cross. When you attempt to go there, that is suicidal. It is the same question that, Dr. George, Clear advised on you and said to you that the court of personality and the question of popularity contests have always, managed a way in our politics. And that's not That's the thing that we must get away from. You know, where individuals we come up and people are attracted to individuals than political institutions. Where does that leave those individuals when they are normal? People don't subscribe to political organization based off the ideological trainings and discipline. You see how in how the core of the personality affected the Chinese Revolution after the death of Chairman Mao Zedong. It took a dog champagne to have to come and resuscitate the Chinese Revolution to where it is today. That propelled China in terms of its economic, output where it is. You want to go back to Ghana, Nkrumah, after the fall of Nkrumah. The core of the personality. Even you want to go to Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, a little fishing village, just dealing with, their lands basically not fertile. But how they managed to disabuse the Singaporeans' mindset from the core of the personality. The Cuban Revolution, you look at Fidel. There is no picture when Fidel Castro was president of Cuba. You couldn't see his images in the streets of Havana because he said to Cubans that we must train more doctors. The Cubans, as a matter of fact, they are friends to the African Revolution. That is why, I gave it up to them. Most African countries gained liberation and freedom because the South African struggle, it couldn't have been successful without the Cubans' involvement. They trained people. So the core of the personality, Mr. Weah, he's popular. You take Mr. Weah from the CDC as an empty vacuum. But you just talk about Mr. Costa, and I must address it. He's my friend. And being as a friend to Mr. Costa, I'm one of the first to advise Mr. Costa and tell him truth. Some things I will not say yet. But Mr. Costa, I think he loves his country to an appreciable extent. And nature does not create a vacuum. So he's working on different fronts, for nation building and so forth. But again, we in progressive politics, we are disciplined to ideas. We're not disciplined to individuals. I mean, if Dr. Thibault today, I'm just being, if Dr. Thibault, for example, I'm just setting an example. If he's no more, does that stop the struggle for social justice? We are not silent. Look on the university campus, and that is why you want certain individuals to be talking. No, they will not talk because the progressive struggle is not on the shoulders of Fambule. He's a single man. The progressive struggle is not on the backs of Dr. Sawyer. Do you want to downplay the utterances of the Student Unification Party? Have Sue been quiet? Sue, if you like, it is the reservoir of ideas. We in the progressive politics have managed to see that we protect the sanctity of the Student Unification Party. Again, regime will try to infiltrate traditional youth and student groupings. Today, the Liberian National Student Union, are they living up to their fundamental responsibility in history? I'm not quite impressed about that. The Federation of Liberian Youth, are they living up to their statutory responsibility? I'm not quite impressed about that. But I'm not surprised because on April 14, 1979, it was Lin Su who endorsed the struggle for social justice. It was not Flower. You had the legs of Councillor Shamo at the time. He was in Federation of Liberian Youth. These were people who condemned the Liberian National Student Union at the time. We just chronicle history. So we move forward from individuals to ideas. And we are not going to stop expanding our ideas. Many of these people you consider popular, Brother Dillon, we supported him. He didn't just get to that level as it is. I'm sure he quite respects us and our politics, so we respect him too. But nature does not create a vacuum. Brother Dillon's emergence as senator of the county was on the question that nature does not create a vacuum. Mr. Weah, his excesses, it angered the people to rally support for Mr. Dillon, not because he was the very most acclaimed person for political leadership. It was the question of disappointment. The people were angry in Mr. Weah. Are they still angry today? Yes. How did this gold-10 Dean, Mr. Weah, who was so loved and admired during his soccer career, why is it now in the country that nobody wants to speak about this man? You say he's building road, he's doing this, but have you also telling us how is he building those property and acquiring them overnight? He's an indigenous man, yes. So am I. So that is why the poor people stranded themselves. They are holding Mr. Weah to account. So yes, here we are not sleeping. The struggle continues. I just love to read a poem, if you don't mind. And this is a poem in honor of the comrades who died on April 14, 1979. Brother Wiwi Deba, Marcus Goba, Mamadou Lavla, Wo Kapitapia, Tony Richardson. And before him, the cadres and militants who marched and fell on April 14, 1979. We are the dead. Short days ago, we lay fell down, sunset glow. Love and we're love. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from falling hands we throw. The touch, you will hold it high. If ye breaks faith, us who die, we shall not sleep. Thank you, comrade. I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to share on your platform. And we always around here to explain a little we understand about progressive struggle. Thank you.
That was the voice of my guest, Mr. Darlington Collins, a follower of the progressive. He believes in them. He believes the progressive remains one of our nation's greatest examples, and I do agree with that. But again, I maintain my criticism, and this is what I'm going to close with. This is where the progressive have fallen short. I repeat, this is where the progressive have fallen short. Unlike the progressive, the civil rights actors of the United States of America, when the civil rights movement realized that they needed to form ranks with an institution to champion their cause, they joined ranks with the Democratic Party at some point in history. Today, the Democratic Party of America is filled with blacks in their majority. And that institution has been the vehicle that the civil rights leaders and their children and their children's children continue to use today in America to fight for their rights, for equal participation in the democratic process in America. Fast forward, that dream that Martin Luther King had will come to fruition because the civil rights leaders knew that they needed to be part of an institution to sustain their ideals and their dreams and their fight for equality. That is what they did. The Democratic Party remains strong today. Blacks are holding leadership in government today. More so, I will argue, because of the institution, the Democratic Party, that the civil rights leaders felt could be an ally for them in their fight for rights and equal participation. My question is, does the progressive have an institution that they are leaving with their children, with their young brothers and sisters, their young comrades, that will be sustained and stayed around, that will espouse their ideas, and that will continue to preach their messages and their dreams? And I know, Darlington Collins, you can't answer that question with a yes. No, you cannot. And that is my assignment to the progressive. Come back. It does not necessarily have to be you. Put an institution together. Let your followers identify that institution. You have reservoir of ideas. No one doubted you. Even your critics admire your excellence, your intellectual powerhouse. But you keep these things in your belly, and your ideas, when you die, they are all gone. You need to bury them in an institution that will be able to champion them, so that that Liberia that you started fighting for yesterday will be realized today. And that is my message to you, my father's progressive, and to my fellow Liberian people. On that note, Mr. Darlington Collins, we can't thank you enough for coming and giving a retrospective analysis of the struggle of the progressive, dating a file by 1979 on that fateful day of April 14. You did very excellent. You were succinct. You were on point on the issue and focus on Liberia. On the hour of politics, will bring you here for you to Esre, Brother Wia, who are calling to you is not a serious man when it comes to governance in our country. We will certainly reach out to you to do that. On that note, the song that unites us is We Are All Liberians, and that song is taking us home. Folks, thank you so very much for following the broadcast. We have another broadcast that is coming on immediately after this one, and that one is called Roundtable Africa, where we discuss the issues about Africa. In this one, we will be discussing a topic called Mancafunification, about John Mancafuni, a development theory or developmental approach that he used to turn his country into a middle-income country. Can we use that? That is why we will be discussing. You do not want to mix it. Again, folks, thank you for watching. I'm Anthony C.A., and I'm also from Negro Town, like Darlington Collins. Bye-bye, folks.
We all Liberians. Liberia is our